The sweet, cloying smell hit me first, so thick I could taste it on my tongue, like overripe fruit left to rot in summer heat. I should have turned back then, should have trusted the primitive part of my brain that screamed warnings. Instead, curiosity pulled me deeper into the undergrowth, branches catching at my jacket as I pushed through the dense foliage that had grown wild and untamed far from any marked trail. I'd been hiking for hours, deliberately choosing paths that led away from the weekend crowds, seeking the kind of solitude that only comes from being truly alone in nature. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive. The irony of that thought would haunt me later. The smell grew stronger as I followed what might have once been a deer path, now overgrown with thorny vines and fallen branches. Something deep in my gut told me to stop, to turn around, but I've always been cursed with an insatiable need to know. My mother used to say curiosity would be the death of me. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. When I finally pushed aside the last curtain of brambles, the sight that greeted me drove the breath from my lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp. There, in a small clearing that felt hidden from the world itself, lay what had once been a man. He was propped against the thick trunk of an ancient oak, his head tilted back as if he'd simply decided to take a nap in this forgotten corner of the forest. But the illusion of peaceful rest shattered the moment my eyes adjusted to the dappled shadows. His skin had taken on the mottled green-black of advanced decomposition, swollen and distended until his clothes stretched tight across his bloated form. Dark fluid had leaked from his mouth and nose, staining his shirt in grotesque patterns. The local wildlife had indeed been dining well. Maggots writhed in exposed wounds, and I could see where larger scavengers had torn away chunks of flesh. His eye sockets were empty, dark hollows that seemed to stare directly at me despite their vacancy. A rusted revolver lay beside his right hand, and even from several feet away, I could see the neat hole in his temple where the bullet had entered. I stumbled backward, my stomach lurching as the full reality of what I'd discovered crashed over me. This wasn't some Halloween decoration or movie prop. This was a human being who had come to this isolated place to end his life, and I had violated his final privacy by stumbling into his chosen resting place. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, grateful that I still had a weak signal, despite being miles from civilization. The 911 operator's voice seemed to come from another world as I struggled to explain what I'd found and provide my approximate location. She instructed me to stay with the body until police arrived, warning me that it could take some time given my remote location. Stay with the body. The words echoed in my mind as I ended the call. The rational part of my brain understood the necessity. This was a crime scene, even if the only crime was self-inflicted. But the primitive, superstitious part of me recoiled at the thought of keeping vigil over the dead. I found a fallen log about 20 feet from the corpse and settled in to wait, trying to position myself upwind to escape the worst of the smell. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. More than once I could have sworn I saw movement from the corner of my vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing but the still form against the tree. As the hours crawled by, I found myself studying the dead man despite my revulsion. He appeared to be middle-aged, though decomposition made it difficult to be certain. His clothes suggested he'd been reasonably well off. Khaki pants, a button-down shirt, expensive hiking boots. A gold wedding ring glinted on his swollen finger, and I wondered about the wife, who was probably still waiting for him to come home, still hoping he'd walk through the door with some explanation for his absence. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, and with it came a creeping dread that settled in my chest like a cold stone. The forest around me seemed to grow quieter, as if the usual sounds of wildlife had been muted by the presence of death. Even the wind seemed to whisper more softly through the leaves, creating an almost reverent hush. When full darkness finally fell, I was alone in the woods with only my phone's flashlight and the corpse for company. The beam of light created a small circle of visibility in the vast darkness, beyond which anything could be lurking. I tried to keep the light pointed away from the body, but the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, making me feel exposed and vulnerable. That's when I first heard it, a sound like a sigh, so soft it might have been the wind. But there was no wind. The air had grown still and heavy, pregnant with the kind of expectant silence that comes before a storm. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, searching for the source of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The silence that followed was absolute, so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself I'd imagined the sound, it came again, longer this time, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It was definitely a sigh, the kind a person makes when they're deeply, profoundly tired. I turned my light toward the corpse, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The head, which had been tilted back against the tree trunk, was now facing forward, facing me. The empty eye socket seemed to bore into my soul, and that lipless mouth hung open in what looked disturbingly like a smile. The sound of approaching vehicles finally broke the spell, and I nearly wept with relief as I saw flashlight beams dancing through the trees. The police had arrived, along with the coroner and a small army of technicians who would process the scene and remove the body. Detective Sarah Martinez took my statement while the others worked. I told her everything: how I'd found the body, the apparent suicide, the long wait in the darkness. I didn't mention the moving head or the sighs. Some things are better kept to oneself. Harold Whitmore, 53 years old, she told me when I asked about his identity. His wife reported him missing 3 days ago. Harold Whitmore. Now we had a name, an identity beyond just the corpse in the woods. Somehow, that made it worse.
The nightmares started that very night. I found myself back in the clearing, but this time I was alone with Harold Whitmore. Not the decomposed corpse I'd discovered, but the man as he must have been in life. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes that burned with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This was my place, my choice, my peace." "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You smell death," he interrupted, taking a step closer. "My death, and now you're part of it, whether you want to be or not." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. Harold continued his approach, and with each step his appearance began to change. His skin took on the mottled green-black of decomposition. His eyes sank back into their sockets, and that terrible sweet smell filled the air. "You want to know what it's like?" he asked, his voice now a wet whisper. "To feel the life drain out of you?" I screamed, jolted awake in terror. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., and my apartment was silent except for the sound of my ragged breathing. But even awake, I could smell it, that sweet, cloying odor of decomposition.
The dreams continued, each one more vivid and disturbing than the last. Harold appeared nightly, cycling between the living man and the rotting corpse. He spoke of death and despair, of the peace he'd found in his final moments, and how I had stolen that peace from him. "You could have that peace too," he whispered during one particularly vivid dream. "All you have to do is follow my example." "I don't want to die," I protested. "Everyone wants to die," he replied with absolute certainty. "Some people are just honest enough to admit it." I woke up to find a kitchen knife on my nightstand, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. I had no memory of putting it there, no recollection of even getting up during the night. The realization that I was losing control of my own actions sent me into a panic. The dreams continued, each one more vivid and disturbing than the last. Harold appeared nightly, cycling between the living man and the rotting corpse. He spoke of death and despair, of the peace he'd found in his final moments, and how I had stolen that peace from him. "You could have that peace too," he whispered during one particularly vivid dream. "All you have to do is follow my example." "I don't want to die," I protested. "Everyone wants to die," he replied with absolute certainty. "Some people are just honest enough to admit it." I woke up to find a kitchen knife on my nightstand, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. I had no memory of putting it there, no recollection of even getting up during the night. The realization that I was losing control of my own actions sent me into a panic. Days passed in a haze of exhaustion and mounting paranoia. The smell came and went without warning, sometimes so faint I wondered if I was imagining it, other times so strong it made me gag. I called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything but the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. Harold's presence grew stronger, more oppressive, until I could barely function. He appeared in mirrors, in photographs, in the corner of my vision. His voice whispered constantly in my ears, telling me about the peace I could have, the release that waited for me if I would just stop fighting. "You're killing yourself anyway," he pointed out during one encounter. "Look at you. You're not eating, not sleeping, barely functioning. Why not just end it quickly?" Terrified, besieged by visions, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that clearing, surrounded by the bodies of his other victims, dozens of them, all reaching for me with rotting hands. And Harold stood in the center of it all, holding that rusted revolver, waiting for me to take it. The photographs appeared in my apartment without explanation, dozens of them showing Harold's body from impossible angles, his empty eye sockets always turned toward the camera. I tore them down, but they reappeared as soon as I turned my back. I found myself driving back to the forest, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The parking area was empty, the crime scene tape long since removed. I walked into the woods, following the path that seemed more defined now, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Harold was waiting for me in the clearing, appearing as he had in life, tall, dignified, with those burning eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "You came back," he said with satisfaction. "I knew you would." "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want you to join me," he replied, gesturing to the trees around us. I looked more carefully and realized with horror that what I had taken for shadows were actually more bodies, dozens of them, all in various stages of decay. "Every person who has found me becomes mine." The rusted revolver materialized in his hand, and he held it out to me like an offering. One pull of the trigger, one moment of courage, and then you'll never have to worry about anything ever again. I stared at the weapon, and for a moment I could almost see the appeal. No more sleepless nights, no more crushing loneliness, just peace. My hand began to reach for the gun, but at the last second something inside me rebelled. I heard laughter, not Harold's cruel mocking, but something warm and genuine. A memory surfaced, myself as a child, playing in my grandmother's garden, chasing butterflies and laughing with pure joy. "That's not real," Harold said, but his voice sounded uncertain. "No," I agreed, lowering my hand. "It doesn't last. But it existed. It was real. And if it was real once, it can be real again." "You're being naive," he snarled. "Life is suffering. Death is peace." "Maybe," I said, feeling stronger. "But I'd rather suffer and hope than give up and settle for nothing." Harold's expression twisted with rage. "You can't reject me. You're mine." "I belong to myself," I said firmly, "and I choose to live." The gun vanished, and Harold let out a howl of fury that shook the very foundations of reality. The other bodies began to move, reaching for me, but I stood my ground. "I choose to live," I repeated, and the words felt like a prayer. The clearing began to fade, the bodies dissolving like smoke. Harold's voice grew fainter. "This isn't over. I'll be waiting." But his words no longer carried weight. I had faced the worst he could offer and chosen to reject it. I opened my eyes to find myself back in my apartment, but it was different now. The photographs were gone, the smell of death had faded, and sunlight streamed through the windows. I was still pale and exhausted, but I was alive. More importantly, I wanted to be alive. The road to recovery was long and difficult. I sought help from professionals who understood that trauma can take many forms. I learned to recognize the difference between Harold's voice and my own thoughts, to separate his despair from my own struggles. I rebuilt, rediscovered joy. I changed jobs, moved to a new apartment, and slowly began to remember what it felt like to experience genuine happiness. Harold still visits sometimes, usually in dreams, but his power over me is broken. I know that the choice between life and death, between hope and despair, is one I make every single day. The scar remains, of course. The memory of that clearing will never fully fade, but scars are proof of survival, evidence that we can endure terrible things and still choose to keep going. I still hike, though I stick to marked trails now. Sometimes I catch a whiff of that sweet smell, and for a moment I'm back in that clearing. But then I remember the sound of childhood laughter, the warmth of the sun on my face, the infinite possibility contained in a single moment of joy, and I choose to live.